introduction slide, which I always have to have a picture, give people a picture of where I actually live, because it's sort of amazing to me that we can have careers and from living in such isolated places. I live in California in the Eastern Sierra, and yes, we have an entire pack of huskies that we chase around when we're not working. And as Chris said, I do a lot of training and I interpret, and I do a lot of stuff in the field. And really in the last 2 years, I'd say the area of this field, which I've had a lot of exposure to and have done a lot of work in, is the educational setting. But I also started in the educational setting. I really cut my teeth being a bilingual person working in social services who got pulled every which way to interpret with no training, when I first began my career. And I spent a lot of time actually interpreting in school settings. And so it's really cool for me to see this come full circle. And now it's, an official topic of conversation. So I want to start the webinar today by framing the conversation some. And this is a comic that kind of makes the rounds. For those of you who are not familiar with educational interpreting, an IEP is an individualized education plan, and it's part of special education, which is a huge component of what educational interpreters have to do. And this comic rightfully shows how utterly sort of terminologically challenging this area is. There's just a lot of jargon and terminology. But before we sort of really dive into educational interpreting, I do like to start from a big frame picture, and then kind of narrow it down so we get a real sense of the context of how this field is starting to emerge. So just very briefly to show everyone, this slide about how big our field is. I think many people in the United States, we don't think about it sort of as just being a big industry, but it is a big industry. It's about it's almost projected to be almost $57 billion by just 2 years from now. And it's continuing to grow and is one of the fastest growing fields in this country and around the world. And just to give you some context for that, we are officially bigger than Hollywood as a profession, which I think surprises a lot of people. But we are much, much smaller than the healthcare industry, which I believe outside of the military is the largest industry in the United States. And this is all relevant actually, because if you think about the part of community interpreting that specialized, first it was medical interpreting, and it specialized partly because healthcare is such a gigantic industry, and the pressure and need to solve the language access issues that were coming up became very acute early on. And those needs are just now kind of beginning to hit educational interpreting. I also wanted to, as a way to frame the conversation, I wanted to share this table with you. One of the ways when we think about parts of our profession beginning to mature is to think about what is the hallmark of a mature profession. And some of the hallmarks of a mature profession would be what's along the top yellow bar here. Is there legislation that requires it? Are there recognized academic degrees for the profession? Do we have a certification process? Do we have a licensure process, which is sort of one step beyond a certification process? What kind of continuing education requirements do we have? And, are there professional associations? And there are lots of other hallmarks, such as, is there a code of ethics, that applies to this field? So if we want to look at, if you look at the column down on the left, if we look at the different areas of interpreting that we consider to be the most developed, you have conference, legal, community, medical, educational, and sign language interpreting, and we kind of absorb this chart for a minute. So if you look in this on this chart, really the only part of our profession that meets all of these criteria is sign language interpreting. And there are reasons for that, not the least of which is that there's more legislation that applies to it. And there's a very empowered and motivated end user of this service. The deaf community in and of itself has been very proactive in making sure their rights are met. And that's not true for spoken language interpreting, where immigrant communities tend to be less empowered. And then if you look at the next profession, actually that's, I wouldn't say it's as mature as conference interpreting, but in terms of ticking off a formally sort of a formal structure inside the profession, legal kind of comes next. And then conference, in this, even though it is the most developed, the oldest in some ways, and the most prestigious perhaps, and the best paid, it actually doesn't, it's still very unformed inside this country. There's not a certification process. It's a peer-based review to get in. There's not licensure. There's not a continuing education requirement. You know, although it is an expectation, but there's not a formal requirement for it. And there's actually no legislation that governs it in the United States. Whereas with all these other specializations, there is legislation, and that legislation is Title VI of the United States Civil Rights Act, which dates back to 1964. And that legislation says that you cannot discriminate based on someone's national origin. And in all the decades since that law was passed, basically the way that our country has solved the problem of not discriminating is to say that you have to solve the language bridge. Like, you have to create a language bridge and solve the language barrier so that people can get equal access to services. So outside of conference, legal, community, medical, educational, and sign language interpreting are typically employed when people are trying to access some kind of service. So if you look at the educational interpreting here and the community interpreting above it, you'll see that there really is a long ways to go still in terms of it formalizing, but it is very parallel to medical interpreting, which is the part of community interpreting that has specialized first. And you can see that medical interpreting actually has come quite a long way in the last 20 years in creating the basic infrastructure for a profession. You may notice that I have partial written down for a couple of these boxes. I say that legal interpreting has a partially recognized academic degrees in medical as well. And that's because there are many certificate programs floating around for legal interpreting and medical interpreting, including the one which I teach for in this school at UMass Amherst. And they're serious. It's not that they're not serious degrees, but there is no uniform, like, if you are going to become an interpreter, this is what has to be part of the degree. Everybody has it. There's a degree track from BA up to an MA up to a PhD. That just doesn't exist for really anything in the United States, not even for conference interpreting. So yes, we have academic programs, but they're not universal in terms of their content, and mostly they don't go beyond a 2-year AA degree. There are a few BAs out there, but not a ton. And in terms of government licensure, legal interpreting does have a Court Interpreters Act for interpreting in federal immigration court, and sign language interpreting has, you know, many state laws, but there really isn't any licensure process per se. There are certification processes. So anyway, that kind of gives you, so you've had time to absorb the table, it gives you a sense of like, where does educational interpreting fit in? So let's keep diving down. So when we think about how a profession matures and emerges, the profession inside the umbrella of community interpreting that specialized first was healthcare interpreting. I happened to stumble into the field kind of right at the beginning. It was only, you know, maybe half a decade into its sort of more formal beginnings, and I've been in it ever since. And it is amazing if you look at the, you know, 1990s to 2019. We've really been able to make a lot of progress, and many things came together in the 90s that tipped healthcare interpreting, and that included big immigration waves that hit the whole country instead of just the coasts like earlier immigration waves had. People started paying attention to the legislation. There was more concern about patient care. And there were actually a lot of state and local laws that came into place that fortified the legal requirement for language access. So healthcare interpreting really has been developing in a very formal way for about 20 years. And I would argue that education interpreting is now at that tipping point. It feels exactly the same like it felt in the late 90s and early 2000s. All of a sudden, it's at the conferences. There are groups of people working in their own school districts in their own states to try and professionalize it. There are efforts at, you know, creating codes of ethics and standards of practice. So I do believe it is going to do something similar to what medical interpreting did. And in the next 10 years, we may start seeing efforts for more testing and more formal, you know, so building some of those building blocks I just showed you in that chart. All right, so we talked a little bit of big picture. Let's make sure we're talking the same definitions. One thing I've learned about in this field is that never assume that people think you're saying the same thing, you know, with the same word. So let's just talk a little bit about the definitions for interpreting. And these are definitions, the first two that come from the International Organization for Standardization, these are standardization organizations that actually, you know, work to define entire professions. And so we've got a formal definition of interpreting. which would be rendering a spoken or signed message into another spoken or signed language, and while preserving the register and meaning of the source language. I know this is not going to be new to any of you, but I do want to contrast it with community interpreting so I can get us all on the same page about what do we mean by community interpreting. And community interpreting internationally has been defined as bidirectional interpreting, so going in both directions, that takes place in some kind of setting among speakers of different languages for the purpose of accessing community and services. And that's really the key part, is that community interpreting is about helping people access some kind of community service. And that, sorry, I'm just get back on track here. And so, that is what actually provides the context for the ethics and standards of practice that community interpreters follow, which really have been best put together by the medical side. So the medical interpreting ethics and standards of practice really govern community interpreting ethics for the time being, until they get their own. So we don't have a definition for educational or education interpreting, but I think we could just piggyback off of community interpreting and say that it's facilitating communication that takes place between two or more parties who don't share the same language when they're accessing education or classroom related services. So like I said, there has been motions and movements in some of the states to try and define what educational interpreting is. And I wanted to share this much longer and kind of dense definition that comes from a first sort of attempt at a code of ethics and standards of practice for educational interpreters of spoken languages, which comes out of the University of Minnesota. And this is their definition is, the way they define it is actually to kind of describe it. So you're talking about, it concludes students and prospective students, parents and guardians, members of the community. It's trying to kind of grab the whole universe of education that gets where this interpreting can take place. And you'll notice that the bottom part is what's most important to me, where they're saying that when your services and education start to overlap with other areas, then you may end up doing legal interpreting or medical, or it may get all mishmashed. And that's what I really want to dive into more as this, as we continue with the talk. But, before going on, I want to make clear that I'm not talking about sign language interpreting, because in sign language interpreting, there's actually a set term, the educational interpreter, and that is the classroom-based sign language interpreter who interprets for a deaf or hard of hearing student. And that is a completely different role, and it sort of has a completely different ethical code around it. And it's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about either spoken language interpreting or sign language interpreting for when sign language interpreters are interpreting for parents when they're trying to access educational services. But it's not that, this is not talking about that sign language interpreter in the classroom. All right, so when we think about educational settings and what the educational universe is, it's really quite gigantic in this country. And this is kind of a nice graphic that separates it out, between the idea of governance. And that's the idea of all of the federal and state laws and the school board ordinances and the city ordinances and the individual school policies that make up the school setting where an individual interpreter or translator is working. Then you've got parents, and legally they have a ton of different rights and responsibilities about, how they're supposed to interact with schools or can interact with schools, and they may or may not know what those are, but they exist. Then you have a lot of formal bodies that are like school site councils and bilingual committees, and the committee, around XYZ. I mean, there's a lot of sort of mixed group formal board entities that work on projects, have meetings, report back to the public. And yes, the interpreters end up interpreting there a lot. And then you have, of course, the teachers who are providing the education, and where parents and students are contacting and interacting with administration, and the interpreter is often in the middle of that. And then, you have the students themselves, and there are many different programs that service students, but I think probably the big juggernaut area that interpreters work in is in special education. That's often where the majority, not all by any means, but where you'll have a huge percentage of assignments or that interpreters are interpreting for is in some kind of special education setting. So let's explore a little bit about who educational interpreters are or are expected to be. I did this deep dive into Indeed.com a couple months ago, when I was putting together something kind of similar, just wanting to see what, how are schools hiring for this position? Because there are thousands of interpreters and translators working in schools across this country already. They're just not really recognized in our profession yet. So here's one that's from Bismarck Public Schools. This is in North Dakota. I want you to take a look at this hourly wage, or what they're earning. It's pretty bad. And really here, this bottom line that says, the essential skill, the ability to produce an accurate, neutral, and impartial version of communication without omissions, alterations, or additions. That's the skill set, plus the general knowledge of the school. So it's kind of a very vague, we're getting out kind of what we want you to do, but we don't really know how to define it. And I think this is a job that's talking about dedicated employees. So and typically that's called a bilingual staff, or the school translator. Less common is school interpreter, although you see in this job description, they do include interpreter, but often it's the school translator. And yes, the interpreter is expected. I mean, you're supposed to be an interpreter and a translator. They don't distinguish it as a distinct, profession or a distinct skill set. Here you have one for Baldwin, New York. And I know we have at least one person on the line who's a Haitian Creole translator interpreter. And here you have a much better pay, $30 an hour. I think that their requirement, and my bar is blocking me, so I'm gonna move it for a minute so I can read it. Experience in translating Haitian Creole and or Spanish. So there's your requirement. What that means, how that's being measured, who knows? But you'll see that the pay is much better. And I think that's because I think this is an indicative of an independent contractor role where they'll be bringing you in as needed. You're not actually an employee. So here's another job description, and this comes from Illinois. And here it's that bilingual paraprofessional. And I think, what the requirements here are, and again, I have to keep moving, this bar doesn't completely go away. So you provide both written translations as well as work as an interpreter as needed during regular hours, and provide these services on a district-wide basis when needed. So again, very little specificity around what the actual skill set is that they're asking for. But this is very, very common kind of job description, and I call it sort of everything but the kitchen sink job description. That's a sort of a saying in English, with this idea that, oh my gosh, I'm expected to bring everything but the kitchen sink. It's an idiom we have in English, and it just kind of means that everything's included, without any kind of discriminating criteria. And dual role employees, we don't have any solid data about if there are more dedicated staff interpreters and translators versus more that are expected to be doing two jobs, where they're hired to do, like this person's hired, they want them to assist the teacher in all aspects of student and or teacher classroom preparation. They're doing lots of non-interpreting and translation work, and they're expected to do the interpreting translation. It's very, very common job description. I think you probably have a different ratio of employees to contractors than you do in the field. Typically in the field, we're about 75% freelance and generalist interpreters, but I suspect that there are more employed people on the educational side. So I wanted to go into this one in depth just a little bit, because this is going to prepare us for the rest of my talk around what is the actual skill set that educational interpreters need. So this is a job announcement for a trilingual interpreter. I put a little map for where this is. This is in sort of a very agricultural, beautiful area in California, where there's a very heavy indigenous population from southern Mexico and Guatemala. So here they want a trilingual Mixteco Spanish English interpreter. And first of all, that's hard to find. I've done a fair amount of work with indigenous interpreters in California, so that's hard to find. They want someone who speaks 3 languages. They want to pay them $24 an hour. And this is a little bit more of a deeper dive into their job description. I'm not going to read all of it, but I want to point out all of the different things this person's expected to do. They're supposed to translate and produce a variety of general, technical, legal, and medical documents, right? And they're supposed to do simultaneous interpreting during various formal meetings as needed. And that's getting to like all those boards and the school boards that we talked about just a minute ago. they have to work in all of these different kinds of settings. So they're expected to provide written translations of IEPs, which are very technical, these individualized educational plans, legal materials, assessments, bulletins, correspondence, meeting minutes, and forms. Remember, they're expected to, they want a trilingual interpreter here. So they're hoping that they're going to get this for their indigenous language as well. They are supposed to provide that simultaneous interpretation using the district interpretation equipment and maintaining that equipment. And so they've got that whole skill set they have to have. And then they are supposed to have correct oral and written usage of English and designated second language and third language, right? So all the correct grammar. And then they're supposed to be able to read, write, and translate English and a designated second language and do that in the opposite. So that's quite the job description. And if any of you, even those of you who are students, you must know by now how many different skill sets that is actually required and how much training you need to be able to do any of that well. And yet, here are the job requirements for this job. This is the education experience that they are expecting, that you will have graduated from high school and maybe have 2 years of experience assisting non-English speakers with translation and interpreting services. Oh, and you need a valid driver's license because it's a rural county and you're going to be driving everywhere. So to me, this is kind of indicative of where the field is at right now. The educational interpreters and translators are just, it's like a magic unicorn. They're being hired to do everything in the field, and the people hiring them are so ignorant about the field that they don't understand even what they're asking people to do. I mean, that's been my experience working in the field. And I don't say that ignorant I'm not meaning to insult or offend anyone. They just are ignorant of what the skill set is. They're making a lot of assumptions about what someone can do when they're bilingual. And they just think, oh, you're bilingual, you can do it. They're kind of back at that stage where we were in medical interpreting 20 years ago. Oh, you're bilingual, no problem, you can do it. Oh, what? Your indigenous language doesn't have a written form? Huh. Well, can you sight translate these parents' rights anyway? You get there's just a lot of that going on right now. And so my hat goes off to all of the interpreters and translators working in this setting, because it's really pioneer days. It's really pioneer days right now still. So now that we've seen the job description, that one that I thought was just very illustrative of what people are wishing they could get and maybe feeling frustrated that they're not getting, let's look at what this really means. What is the interpreter skill set that people are asking for? Well, I think the first one that you've seen already is that they're asking for 2 professional skill sets without realizing that what they're doing. All of these job descriptions say interpreter and translator. And I can't think of another setting in our field where that's true. I mean, medical interpreting and legal interpreting and conference interpreting all are very, very clear on the fact that translation and interpretation are 2 separate skill sets. They're obviously sister professions, but it is not, translators can't necessarily interpret and vice versa for many reasons. So the fact that these 2 fields are completely mushed together in schools is very problematic for the people who are being hired, and also for people who are working now to try and professionalize these fields, because really they need to be separated. Or I don't know, that we need to have a better solution than just you can do it all. and then so one, they're being asked to do 2 things, and then I just wanted to share this slide a little bit to give a sense of all the different places that they're being asked to and expected to interpret, because these settings require different interpreting skills. What you need to do during a parent-teacher meeting with a dialogue between 3 or 4 people is a very different use of your skills than if you're doing press conferences, which I have seen often, where they pull the bilingual secretary and stick her in front of the microphone when there's been a lockdown or a school shooting or some kind of disaster, and then that person is stuck there doing something extremely public, which actually in other settings only conference interpreters do after they have their master's degree, right? So, or they, you might be doing board meetings, which again is a lot of simultaneous interpreting. So there's just an extreme range, like the setting is so broad in this field. And it's also very, very technical. Even though medical and legal have high register, terminology, and you have to have a lot of knowledge about medicine or law, and it's complex and it's technical. It's just not as technical as education. I still have experienced educational interpreting as being the most technical field I've ever worked in. And just even from something as simple as a kindergarten progress report, where you've got produce most English phonemes comprehensively while orally reading their own writing simple sentences or text, like use common English morphemes. I mean, this is terminology that no parent, very few parents understand. And this for a 5-year-old, and it just gets worse as you go on. You know, so when you're sight translating this kind of stuff, do you have the terminology? How are you dealing with it? And then you have things like the psychosocial evaluation for an individualized education plan in special ed, where there's just endless numbers of, you know, neurological, psychological, medical tests that end up in front of you that you are either interpreting about or sight translating. And it's very technical. And if you don't get these documents ahead of time, good luck, right? It's very technical. Here's another example of a 6th grade progress report, right? All in numbers. Performs operations with multi-digit whole numbers and with decimals to hundredths. You know, yes, you can understand all of it, but you better have your you know, mathematics terminology quite sharp in order to be able to sight translate any of this during a parent-teacher meeting. And then you have a simultaneous, you know, board meeting discussion that can go. I have been at board meetings where I have interpreted for presentations from the solar equipment company that has been contracted to build solar panels on top of the parking lot. I mean, it's like conference interpreting. It doesn't just keep itself to education. It could be anything that you end up interpreting for at these board meetings, and it's simultaneous with equipment, right? Hopefully it's simultaneous with equipment and may or may not be mic'd fully. So it's just a huge skill set that you're being asked to do. And then you have lots of handwritten reports that you have to, you know, please, can you sight translate this? You've got to have strategies for that. And then you have probably the most acronymed environment that I've ever been in. This is just a small sample of some of the very common acronyms you might deal with in this setting. And you can see that if you underline these, I'm going to underline all of the ones that are legal. And you'll see that there are only 2 of these sort of random selection of terms out of this glossary. Only 2 of them aren't based on some kind of legal legislative process, right? And the ones that aren't are based on some kind of formal psychological designation. So legal interpreting is a huge part of educational interpreting. And that's where, you know, this sort of brief dive through what the skill set is, you know, brings us to is that, you know, we, in this country, we did not generalize as a profession. Sign language interpreting did. When you become a sign language interpreter, you have to have at least 2 years, an associate degree in sign language interpreting, and then you specialize into legal or conference, which would be a lot more logical and beneficial for us to have that educational pathway, but we don't. So what did we do? We specialized with conference, we specialized with legal, we specialized with medical. And we've developed our own codes of ethics. And, you know, if you study, you get lucky and get into a program like this one that will give you, you know, a touch of legal, a touch of medical, but they're viewed as separate and distinct tracks and kind of taught. There's different skill sets. I mean, you get this, it's the same general skill set, but they get emphasized in different ways. And I would argue that educational interpreting is actually all 3 of these. You have to have all 3 skill sets. You have to know simultaneous, and you need to know the conference kind of simultaneous. You have to be very aware of when something is legal, and you have to know how to handle your modes with the precision that you're expected to in legal interpreting and follow legal ethics. And you have to also understand the community interpreting and how your ethics play out and how you know, can sort of monitor around understanding for some of the sessions, but not all. And you have to have some kind of decision-making process to know when you're in what part, like these are all these things that the field just hasn't decided. Like we're just describing and defining it at this point. So when we think about that educational interpreter skill set, you know, a full interpreting skill set for any specialization includes understanding your role, knowing what your code of ethic is, what are the correct protocols, like how do you intervene, how do you interrupt, can you monitor for understanding or not, who do you start with if you have to stop interpreting and solve a problem, what kind of decision-making skills do you have to have, are you doing dialogic or monologic consecutive, is it short or long consecutive, are you using note-taking, what kind of note-taking, I mean this would be the full skill set, and are you sight translating? And to me, I would argue that you need all of it. like you can't actually do what we've done in medical interpreting, which is to train people to very strong around ethics and limits and boundaries and knowing their role, and training them very well with a good solid consecutive and hopefully a good solid site translation, and kind of not training them to simultaneous. You can't do, like the very first day you walk into an educational setting, you have to have that simultaneous there. It's just not an option. So I feel like it's a very, very challenging field to start to professionalize, because the complexity of what people have to do every single day requires a conference level, master's degree level skill set, honestly. And I'm not quite, and we're going to have to somehow help train people up using short course and, certificate training programs, at least at the beginning. So we have a big challenge. So for me, basically you've got everything and the kitchen sink, not but the kitchen sink, but and the kitchen sink. And like I said, you've got this huge question, like, how do we go about doing this? So I want to end by talking for just a few minutes about a case study that from the Orange County Department of Education, where they have come quite a long ways towards beginning to professionalize their interpreters and translators. And they're, when we think about the barriers that they have to overcome, these are some of the barriers that this, working with the school district, that they identified, right? Like, in order to start professionalizing, you have to overcome this idea that you're bilingual, you can do it all. You have to get buy-in and support from bosses. You have to somehow find trainers who can train interpreters in settings that they're probably haven't done a lot of training in. We don't have a lot of educational interpreting trainers. We don't have education specific resources, although some are beginning to be created. And it's just not an entry-level setting. Like it just isn't. You need to have advanced skills right from the beginning. So it's kind of the conundrum. So let's just look briefly at what the Orange County Department of Education has done and is doing, because I think it gives a good roadmap for how things are emerging. When we want to think about emerging models, I think they show a nice example. And they're just one example. There are many, many large departments of education around the country that are doing the same thing in their own way. So this is a huge Department of Education in Southern California. And you can see there's 63 language, 500,000 students. It's quite extensive. And they, did a big survey, which they have a very dynamic woman there named Natalia Barca. And when she got into her position in sort of an administrative place and was tasked with training and, figuring this language access thing out, first thing she did was gather data. And so she got some really valuable data about how all, 75% of their school districts have monthly requests, that 82% are for IEP meetings, that they're related to these different processes, and that they involved communicating with student family members. So she got a lot more information than this. It's just kind of an example. One of the other things she found out was, in our district, well, look, almost 30% of our school districts already have a formalized team with a coordinator. They're already providing some kind of training. You've got people supporting training. So she kind of found out where the needs were, and then started to, over the last 4 years, has done a lot of things. And what she's done over the last 4 years, let me get this to go, was first she identified all those key players, because you're talking institution change, like to actually formalize this field, there's a lot of institutional change that has to take place from inside the schools. So who are the key players? You've got your administrators at the school levels, at the district levels, you've got superintendents, you have the English learner departments, you have language service coordinators, you have directors of special education, and who these are exactly are going to depend on the actual district. And then based on all the data she gathered, they created kind of a plan. And one thing they did, and they're on their this coming year, they'll be on their 4th annual Interpreters and Translators Conference, which has been wildly successful. They get over 300 people at this conference. And I will, to tell you in comparison, it took the California Healthcare Interpreting Association almost 10 years to get more than 300 people at a conference, and they've got it almost from the first year. So it shows you the demand and the need and the pent-up need. They established the Interpreter of the Year Award. They've got training for trainers. So they went and got licensed through the Community Interpreter Program, several people, and they've been training their interpreters for the several years off that license. They're defining what their ethical practice is. They're trying to standardize terminology. And so basically she came up with, in their case, sort of this pathway to how they could start to professionalize in their school district by getting the data, identifying the key players, connecting their translation and interpreting to legal compliance, educating the school district about Title VI, you know, using whatever leverage they could to say, hey, this isn't just a good thing to do, we need to be doing it. They started to develop lots of awareness and build trust and to build capacity, you know, actually improve the skill set, improve professional behavior and conduct through training, and then creating recognition and awards and making it something, providing incentive for people to want to professionalize. So if we kind of go up our ladder, we can go up our little ladder. And in their case, you know, they have a long ways to go, but they are definitely on the pathway to professionalizing. And this is what we're seeing all over the country. And this is exactly what happened in medical interpreting. So to close out my talk, I wanted to share that another effort that's been underway since the summer is something that's now being called the Interpreting and Translation and Education Work Group. And basically it's a national effort that has been sparked to try to create a code of ethics and standards of practice for educational interpreters before we get a bunch of state level codes, because that started to happen in medical and actually made things pretty complicated. And one of the strongest things medical interpreting has done is to have a national code of ethics and standards of practice that everyone buys into, because it just can kind of build off from there. So this group has been going since summer. We were able to have an inaugural meeting at the Orange County Conference in September. And we're just about at the process of being able to announce out a more formal process for how to get the work group is gonna, you know, try and set up a national committee to create these codes of ethics. And you can sign up for the listserv that will, that will, to be part of that group and to be updated about it, and to if you want to be involved. And that's one of my December tasks, is to finish the website for this site. So in closing, I just want to say that for me, I feel like educational interpreters and translators deserve to be trained, well-paid professionals. The work they're doing is astonishing. It is so complex. They need our support of the entire profession. And I hope some of you who are listening, especially if you're students or teach trainers, will consider lending your skill set to this area, because I think it's really, really interesting, dynamic, diverse, and challenging area to be working in. So with that, I'll close up and I'll open it up for question and answer. And thanks for listening.